Imagine dedicating years to your career, building a life with someone you trust, only to have it all shattered in a single night. A drunken confession. A betrayal deeper than you ever expected. And a choice: walk away or burn it all to the ground. This is a story about deception, revenge, and the ultimate reckoning. Stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. The atmosphere inside the lounge pulsed with energy. Laughter and the hum of conversation blended with the clinking of glasses, as the office gathered to celebrate the successful completion of a major project. Drinks flowed, smiles were exchanged, and for a brief moment, the stress of the past weeks faded into the background. Jason moved through the crowd, nodding politely at colleagues who patted him on the back or raised their drinks in his honor. He was never one to bask in attention, but tonight, he was the center of it. The project had been grueling, the stakes high, yet they had pulled it off, his leadership ensuring its flawless execution. Near the bar, a familiar figure stood slightly apart from the others. Eric, his boss, was easy to spot. His tie was loosened, his posture slightly off balance, a nearly empty glass of whiskey dangling from his fingers. He had been drinking more than usual, and Jason knew what excessive alcohol could lead to, especially in corporate settings. It was best to check in before things spiraled. As he made his way across the room, Jason exchanged a few words with others, but his focus remained fixed on Eric. By the time he reached him, the older man had slumped against the counter, his unfocused gaze shifting lazily. At first, the conversation seemed harmless. Eric, in his drunken state, showered him with exaggerated praise, slurring about how no one else could have pulled off what Jason had done. The words rolled off easily, expected even, considering how many drinks he had consumed. But then, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Eric leaned in, his voice dropping, his breath laced with alcohol. His words came out slow, deliberate, each syllable landing like a weight Jason hadn't been prepared for. He was talking about Natalie. The mention of her name alone was enough to send a chill through Jason's spine. But Eric wasn't merely complimenting her. His words, crude and laced with implication, carried an undercurrent of something far worse. He spoke about her in a way no man should speak about another's wife. Admiration turned to something darker, something invasive. Jason stiffened, his grip tightening around the drink in his hand. He wanted to believe it was just the alcohol talking, that once sober, Eric would realize the gravity of his words and regret them. But that wasn't what happened. The drunken confidence only grew. He crossed a line that no amount of alcohol could excuse. Then came the final blow, the proposition. The moment Eric offered money in exchange for a night with Natalie, the world around Jason seemed to tilt. The sounds of celebration dulled, the conversations, the music, the laughter, it all faded into a distant hum. His mind barely registered the glass slipping from his fingers, shattering against the polished floor. Before he had time to think, before he could even process the full extent of the insult, his fist connected with Eric's jaw. The impact sent Eric stumbling backward, knocking into a nearby table. Glasses crashed to the ground, shattering on impact, and gasps rippled through the crowd. The once lively celebration had fallen into stunned silence. All eyes turned to Jason, then to Eric, who lay sprawled on the floor, clutching his face in disbelief. A wave of realization crashed over Jason, but it wasn't regret that settled in his chest, it was something colder. Someone called his name, but the voice barely registered. He turned away from the scene, pushing past the onlookers, and walked straight out of the lounge. The moment he stepped outside, the cool night air rushed over him, but it did little to steady the storm inside. His pulse thundered, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The audacity, the sheer level of disrespect, how had Eric thought he could say those things and walk away unscathed? Footsteps echoed behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Adam had followed him out. Jason kept walking, his thoughts too tangled, his hands still clenched into fists. He had spent years keeping his composure, ensuring that his career remained untarnished, playing by the rules. And now, with one punch, everything had changed. Adam finally caught up, slowing his pace to match Jason's stride. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. "You need to clear your head," Adam finally said, his voice level, calm. "Take a walk. Figure out your next move." Jason exhaled sharply, his breath misting in the cold. He didn't need advice, he needed to understand what came next. Eric was still his boss. That moment inside the lounge wasn't just a personal confrontation, it was a professional disaster waiting to unfold. And yet, no part of him regretted what he had done. As the city lights blurred around him, one thing became painfully clear: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the quiet hum of normalcy that Jason found unsettling. His hands curled around a cup of coffee, the warmth doing little to ground him. Across from him, Natalie moved through her routine, unaware, or perhaps pretending to be, that something had shifted irreversibly between them. The night before still played in his mind, each moment burned into his memory. The party, the laughter, the camaraderie, it had all shattered the second Eric opened his mouth. What had started as drunken admiration had quickly spiraled into something grotesque, something Jason could never have anticipated. He could still hear the words, the leering tone, the proposition that turned his stomach. His reaction had been immediate, uncalculated. He had lashed out before logic could catch up, before the weight of consequences could register. The impact of his fist against Eric's jaw had been brief, yet the aftermath had lingered, rippling outward like a crack spreading through glass. Now, sitting across from his wife, Jason finally forced himself to speak. He told her everything. Natalie listened, her expression unreadable. There was no visible anger, no outrage, just quiet, measured processing. He watched her closely, waiting for her reaction to align with what he had expected. It never did. When she finally responded, her words were cautious, calculated. She was concerned, yes, but not in the way he had anticipated. She didn't dwell on the violation, on the audacity of the proposition. Instead, her focus was elsewhere. The consequences. The damage to his career. The fallout. Jason barely heard her as unease crept through him. The woman he had known for years should have been furious. She should have shared his disgust, his sense of betrayal. Instead, she spoke in tempered tones, as though she were carefully choosing which emotions to display. The realization settled uncomfortably in his chest. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and walked out. Jason drove without a destination, the city passing in a blur as his thoughts churned. Every moment from the morning replayed alongside the memory of the night before. Something wasn't right. Natalie's reaction wasn't right. He had expected anger. Instead, he had found detachment. Almost on instinct, he ended up outside Victor's house. If there was one person who could cut through the confusion, it was him. Victor opened the door before Jason could even knock, his gaze immediately assessing the situation. Without a word, he led Jason inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the space. Jason dropped onto the couch, exhaustion seeping into his bones. He laid everything out, Eric's words, the fight, Natalie's response. He left nothing unsaid. Victor listened in silence, his face darkening as the story unfolded. When Jason finished, the pause that followed was thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Victor leaned back, exhaling slowly. There was no sugarcoating in his response, no attempt to soften the truth. He confirmed what Jason had been avoiding: Natalie's reaction wasn't normal. If anything, it raised more questions than it answered. The possibility either of them wanted to say aloud hung between them. Had Natalie and Eric interacted before? Jason wanted to dismiss the thought entirely. But the doubt had already taken root, and no matter how much he tried to shake it, it refused to fade. Victor didn't push further, but his words stayed with Jason long after he left. As he drove home, the city lights flickering in his periphery, one thing became clear: this wasn't paranoia. This wasn't overthinking. Something was wrong. And he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. The tension in Jason's home had become a living, breathing thing. Conversations with Natalie had grown shorter, her late nights more frequent. Excuses came easily, explanations vague. She moved through their shared space like a stranger, her presence familiar yet distant. He watched, observing the shifts, the way she avoided lingering in the same room for too long. The weight of suspicion pressed against his chest, heavy and suffocating. He hadn't wanted to believe Victor's suggestion, but doubt had already started to fester. Natalie wasn't acting like someone who had been wronged, she was acting like someone who had something to hide. Jason wasn't the type to jump to conclusions without evidence. He needed proof. His chance came late one evening. Natalie had left for another supposed late-night meeting, her phone buzzing constantly throughout dinner. She was careful, keeping it within reach, but Jason had noticed something, a habit, almost unconscious. She backed up her data to their shared cloud storage. Sitting in the dim glow of his laptop screen, Jason accessed it. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he would recognize it when he found it. It didn't take long. Messages. Photos. Exchanges that left little room for misinterpretation. They weren't careless, but they weren't exactly cautious either. The time-stamps stretched back months, reaching into moments Jason had thought were solid, untouchable. Dinners, anniversaries, nights when she had been working late. They were all tainted now, rewritten with the truth he had refused to see. Natalie and Eric. Jason stared at the messages, his breathing slow and measured, his heartbeat deafening. He should have felt rage, but all he felt was cold detachment. The betrayal was already complete. Anger would do nothing to change that. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, scrolling further. What had started as personal betrayal twisted into something bigger. There were more messages, different in nature, discussing figures, deals, names Jason recognized from company briefings. It wasn't just an affair. It was corruption. Eric and Natalie hadn't just been sneaking around behind his back. They had been manipulating company finances, using inside information to shift stocks in their favor. Transactions linked to fake accounts, deals that had seemed too convenient in hindsight. It was all there, laid out in messages they had never imagined anyone else would see. Jason sat back, exhaling through his nose, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. They weren't just liars. They were criminals. And now he had the proof to destroy them both. Jason didn't go to work the next day. He needed time, space to think. The weight of what he had uncovered was too heavy to carry without a plan. Victor was the first person he called. They met at a quiet diner, away from prying eyes. Jason slid a folder across the table, filled with printed copies of what he had found. Victor flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each passing moment. "This is bigger than I thought," he muttered, shaking his head. "They weren't even trying to hide it." Jason remained silent, watching his friend process the information. He had gone through the same realization the night before. The betrayal, the audacity, the sheer scale of it, it was staggering. Victor looked up. "What's your next move?" Jason exhaled slowly. "I don't just want to expose them. I want to make sure they can't recover from this." The company had given Eric power, influence. He had used it recklessly, believing himself untouchable. Natalie had stood by his side, knowing exactly what she was doing. They thought they had played their game perfectly. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The corporate gala was a spectacle of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in a golden glow, and the hum of polite conversation filled the space. Guests dressed in their finest moved through the crowd with practiced grace, exchanging handshakes, laughter, and empty words of admiration. Jason stood at the edge of the room, watching it unfold. It was a familiar scene, one he had attended year after year. But this time, everything was different. This was no longer just an evening of celebration, it was the stage for something far greater. Eric commanded the room as he always did, his confidence unwavering. He moved effortlessly from one conversation to the next, greeting shareholders, exchanging pleasantries with executives. Natalie was beside him, poised and polished, offering knowing smiles, her charm intact. They had no idea their carefully curated world was about to collapse. Jason had ensured that every detail of this night was set in motion long before he arrived. The evidence had been compiled, verified, and prepared for an audience that mattered. The plan had been crafted with precision, and now, all that remained was execution. As the evening's program commenced, the crowd quieted, their attention shifting to the stage. Jason stepped forward, the microphone cool in his grip, the weight of the moment settling over him. A series of slides appeared on the massive screens behind him. At first, they were unassuming: company figures, financial projections, performance trends. But as the images changed, so did the atmosphere in the room. The numbers didn't add up. The transactions were questionable. The emails and messages that followed erased any doubt. Carefully selected snippets of conversations between Eric and Natalie, references to deals that should never have existed, proof of manipulation and stolen opportunities. The silence was immediate. Then, the rustling of movement, shifting seats, the low murmur of realization creeping through the audience like a slow-burning fire. Eric's once confident posture stiffened, his face draining of color. He understood now. Natalie barely moved, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table, her mask of composure cracking at the edges. Security was already in motion. Jason didn't have to say another word. The truth was laid bare, undeniable, inescapable. As Eric was escorted out, Jason watched without satisfaction, only finality. Natalie turned once, her expression unreadable, before disappearing into the chaos. The evening continued, but the celebration had long since ended. The fallout was swift. By morning, news outlets had already picked up the scandal, their headlines plastered with accusations of corporate fraud, insider trading, and professional misconduct. Eric and Natalie had become the center of a public storm, their names dragged through the mud as investigations deepened. Jason watched it unfold from a distance. He had played his role, revealed the truth, and now, the consequences were out of his hands. The company moved quickly to mitigate the damage, issuing statements, reassuring investors, severing ties with those involved. Eric had been terminated immediately, his assets frozen pending further review. Natalie, once poised and calculating, had vanished into obscurity, her name whispered in hushed tones among those who had once admired her. Jason wasn't surprised when legal proceedings followed. The weight of the evidence ensured there would be no escape. Depositions, court filings, official statements, it all became a blur of formalities. He attended meetings, answered questions, provided the necessary details, but emotionally, he had already moved on. What lingered wasn't anger, nor was it regret. It was a strange kind of emptiness. The company, recognizing the role he had played in exposing the corruption, offered him a new position, a leadership role, one with influence and control. Jason accepted, not because he sought power, but because he refused to let people like Eric define the future of the company. The divorce from Natalie was finalized without resistance. She had no ground to stand on, no leverage left. The house, the assets, the life they had built together, it all unraveled in a matter of signed documents and official agreements. He hadn't expected closure, and he didn't find it there. One evening, Jason received a call. Victor's voice was cautious, hesitant in a way that was unusual. Eric had been found dead in his holding cell. The official report cited suicide, though speculation swirled. Jason processed the news with detachment. It wasn't justice. It wasn't relief. It was just another ending to a story that had long since lost its meaning to him. He didn't attend the funeral. He didn't reach out to Natalie. There was nothing left to say. Instead, he focused on rebuilding, not the company, not the image, but himself. He reconnected with those who had stood by him, spent time with people who saw him for more than what had happened. He learned to exist outside of betrayal, outside of resentment. The past had already taken too much. He refused to give it anything more. As he stepped into his new role, the city moving endlessly beyond his office window, Jason felt something unfamiliar settle within him. Not victory. Not closure. Just freedom.